third of the talks that we are doing as part of the Jewish Stories event. I've been so honored to have Professor Jesus Hembrina, Dr. Isaac Amon here in Iowa City with us for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and it has just been such a pleasure to be able to, as was mentioned on Monday, launch the Jewish Studies undergraduate certificate with an event centered on Sephardic history, identity, and culture, and then specifically hear a lot of details about the history of Sephardic history and also the wonderful work that Dr. Humphreys is doing in Zamora. So today's talk, Dr. Amon is going to be speaking specifically about In the Shadow of the Inquisition, the U.S. constitutional right to liberty of conscience. Before we start, I do want to very quickly acknowledge our sponsors, which include the Jewish Studies Working Group, the Anne Frank Initiative, International Programs, which is of course this space is International Program Space, the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies, Center for Human Rights, Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Department of History, and the Department of Religious Studies and of Classics. And so, without further ado, Dr. Amon.
Thank you, Denise. Hello, everyone. Thanks for sticking around for the end. We marry few who have made it over the course of 3 days to the end. And I think that today's talk, a presentation or lecture is designed to kind of bring the legacy of Sepharad, or the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, to something that's very important, and that is something we often take for granted today living in the United States, and that's that we all have what's effectively deemed to be an inalienable right to liberty of conscience, to think as we please, to worship as we please, to express ourselves free of governmental constraints or persecution. And so I'd just like to, of course, go through this history, principally looking at the Inquisition, how it operated from a criminal perspective, some of the procedural techniques it utilized to obtain a confession, which was key for it. Then we'll look at kind of the concept of liberty of conscience as it developed in the Enlightenment period and how that kind of came to culminate in the American experiment in the late 18th century. And again, the principles that have made their way to us today. So we are the beneficiaries of all these centuries of contests, of persecution, and we should be very thankful for the times and the place in which we live. So, okay, I guess I've got to use the mic here, the mouse. I'd just like to acknowledge that I am Director of Academic Research at Jewish Heritage Alliance, which is an educational organization, a nonprofit, dedicated to researching, preserving, promoting the legacy of Sepharad, or the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. And as part of this alliance system, we are comprised of about 50, maybe over now, strategic and affiliate partners, including universities, institutions, organizations, communities around the world, in the public and private sectors, including some governments, all dedicated to preserving the core mission, again, of the legacy of Sepharad. And this is achieved through various means, including physical exhibits. One notably is called At the Crossroads of Sepharad in the Footsteps of the Crypto Jews. It's a mobile or traveling or capsule exhibit devised in collaboration with the Anu Museum of the Jewish People, previously Beit HaFutzot in Tel Aviv, launched in New York and Paris, and we hope will travel to other cities around the world, bringing the story of the legacy of Sepharad to various places. Of course, we've traditionally had online webinars, and we may very well be bringing them back, at least to a certain extent. And then, of course, very much so on-site lectures, programs, events in various communities, synagogues, cultural institutions. And importantly, JHA also does tour programs to Spain and Portugal. We also acknowledge Morocco, part of South America as well, but the real interest, of course, is Iberia, is Sepharad. So in Portugal, I have a few brochures that I brought with me as well, and I'm happy to hand them out at the end if people would like more information. So with that, we can, I think we can get started. So again, effectively 3 threads in this overall tapestry: the procedure of the Inquisition, a history of the Inquisition, the Enlightenment in the European context, and lastly, the American experiment. Each of these threads is really immense, of course, and worthy of a lifetime of study. So Obviously, I can't cover every single thing, so if someone notices, why didn't I cover this, why didn't I talk about it? Well, obviously, as is inevitable, right, we have to pick and choose to try to kind of go with the narrative here. So we'll start with the history and procedure of the Iberian Inquisition, or really the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. But to really begin, the question is, let's go back to the beginning, right? Let's start with the very concept of heresy. What is heresy? Heresy derives from the Greek word heresis, which means choice. And by late antiquity, it came to specifically refer to a dispute of religious doctrine and belief. For heresy to exist, in other words, an established dogma or effectively orthodoxy must exist. Right? An orthodox creed converts dissenting beliefs into heresy. Neither exists, in a sense, without the other. They need each other, right? It's only when those in a position of power or authority define a certain belief or creed as heretical it comes to be such. And these can obviously change over time. Now, in Christendom, multiple Christian beliefs, Christian ideas existed, all claiming descent from the original disciples and the first apostles. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Western Europe in particular began to form what one scholar, R.I. Moore, has famously called a persecuting society. Widespread fixation with perceived dangers to the unity of the Catholic Church in the form of heretics, lepers, and Jews emerged, and gradual restrictions were placed upon these groups. Heresy was defined also by Robert Grosseteste, the Catholic Bishop of Lincoln, England, in the 12th century as, quote, an opinion chosen by human faculties, contrary to Holy Scripture, openly taught, and pertinaciously defended. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III decreed that heretics were to be excommunicated, their property confiscated, and they were to be punished by secular authorities. Rulers who failed to exterminate heresy within their own lands themselves were to be stripped of their power. Jews at this point were also to be segregated and compelled to wear a star or special garb to distinguish them from Christians. To prevent this inquisitorial, quote-unquote, procedure from being used for political purposes, Pope Gregory IX, as seen here, instituted the medieval Inquisition in 1233, asking for, quote, this insidious serpent of heresy to be eliminated and reserving the right of punishing heretics to the Church. Itinerant monks and preachers from the Franciscan and Dominican orders wandered through villages across the countryside of France, Italy, and Germany, really, though, on an ad hoc basis. From May 1245 to August 1246, over 5,700 men and women were interrogated in Toulouse about possible heresies. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV, calling heretics, quote, murderers of souls, authorized the use of torture to extract confessions from them, albeit within officially prescribed limits. And significantly, no permanently organized tribunal supported by the state yet existed. That only came with the official papal establishment of the Inquisition in Spain in 1478 and later in Portugal in 1536, the two countries which of course comprise the Iberian Peninsula, Sepharad in Hebrew, and as we know, hence Iberian Jews are Sephardim. And so situated at the confluence of countries, cultures, civilizations, Iberia came to produce this unique ethos that these Sephardim have carried with them. Now, in Spain and Portugal, these tribunals, we must acknowledge, were not monolithic in scope, structure, or focus, but both emerged to ferret out heretical depravity in their kingdoms, eventually including their colonies around the world. In its earliest phase, they were obsessed with uncovering a particular type of heresy, crypto-Judaism. They felt it threatened the unity of Christendom, and inquisitors were accordingly given vast resources, support, and means to expose and reconcile these heretics, so the nominal Catholics who were Judaizing, or practicing Jewish traditions in secret, to the Catholic Church, and detailed legal procedures were produced and promulgated. Inquisitorial records in Barcelona show that in 1505, 99.3% of all suspected heretics were of Jewish origin. As late as 1530, 50 years after the Inquisition had been established in Spain, over 90% of suspects in Valencia were still of Jewish origin. The decision to create these tribunals, notable for their extraordinary longevity, 3.5 centuries around the globe, being subject to the monarch alone, not accountable to the Pope, in an obsession, again, with this particular type of heresy, crypto-Judaism, distinguished the Spanish and Portuguese variants, versions, of these are tribunals from their medieval predecessor, their Roman counterpart, which notoriously tried Galileo. To the Inquisition, heresy was a mortal sin, for which only confession and appropriate penance could rectify this grievous defect. So legal procedure was incredibly detailed, all designed to encourage a confession. Confessions were sought because an individual's self-denunciation or self-incrimination, we could say, was the highest possible form of proof, especially in cases of heresy. How do you have witnesses to what you believe? So confession came to be known as the Queen of Proofs, the Regina Probatianum. Self-incrimination, however, was not sufficient. It must include denunciation of others. And upon denunciation and investigation, as the slide attempts to show, the prosecutor would issue, in effect, an arrest warrant. The accused would be detained, their property and goods confiscated. The accused would be interrogated and urged to confess, obviously for the benefit of their soul. The Inquisition insisted on absolute secrecy in virtually every aspect of the proceedings. It's the most notorious aspect of these tribunals. The proceedings, again, infamously kept secret, and most glaringly, the accused was denied the ability to confront their accusers, to see the evidence, to even initially know the charges under which they had been arrested. In some cases, procedural safeguards, limited as they were completely dispensed with, so that arrest preceded any formal examination, leaving the accused to languish in inquisitorial jail for months or even years. A person was presumed to be guilty upon arrest, and there was no speedy trial. For once it officially began, the trial was composed of a series of audiences and interrogation sessions rather than a single act carried out in a single room within a set period of time, as we understand the trial today. For example, the cleric Gabriel Escobar, arrested in Toledo in 1607, died in prison 15 years later before his trial had concluded. Even after formal charges were presented to the accused, the tribunal did not list the names of the accusers. As a possible defense, the accused could attempt to exclude adverse testimony by naming individuals who bore a grudge or personal animosity. And as a famous example, in 1572, Fray Luis de Leon at the University of Salamanca succeeded in identifying accusers by naming virtually all his colleagues as possible accusers, and those in academia will can identify, I think, to some extent, maybe. Should I be careful what I say here? In general, however, the inability to know one's accuser or details of the alleged crime made it impossible to adequately defend oneself. Although the Inquisition permitted and later even appointed defense advocates, their primary duty was to the tribunal. A zealous defense of the accused could even lead to charges of heresy against the lawyer, and in discussions between the advocate and the accused, an inquisitor was to be present. There was no court of appeal, including the Holy See, right, the Pope, as there again was in the medieval and the Roman models, and torture was legally countenanced, though less frequently than is popularly assumed. But methods included the garrucha, or strappado, the pulley-based system, as you can see here, hanging the accused from this pulley with heavy weights attached, often dislocating limbs. The toca, or waterboarding, which simulated drowning, and the potro, or the rack. Victims could sometimes undergo all three methods of torture before they would confess. Inquisitorial rules recognized that confessions obtained through torture were coerced. They thus mandated the accused freely, quote unquote, ratify the confession the next day. And since rules forbade anyone to be tortured more than once, the legal subterfuge was utilized at the end of every session was a mere suspension and not a formal end. If the accused refused to ratify, threats could be made to resume the torture. And so the inquisitors were thus both judge and jury, prosecution and defense, and the prisoner's fate depended entirely on the mood and character of the inquisitors. Now, following the end of a trial, what were the sentences? They could end in an acquittal, which virtually never happened, a relaxation in the case of repeat or unrepentant heretics, a euphemism, right, for handing the suspect over to secular authorities to be burnt at the stake. In the vast majority of cases, the accused would be reconciled to the church after undergoing a form of penance, such as being sent on pilgrimage or exile, undergoing lashes, permanent confiscation of goods, serving a term of years in jail. But even after this punishment, the public humiliation remained. For the condemned would have to wear the dunce's cap, or coroza, and a San Benito, the penitential garment on top of their clothes depicting names, social status, and crimes. And so after death, this San Benito would be hung up in the local church, transferring the infamy from one generation to the next. And this meticulous procedure culminated in the auto da fe, or act of faith, composed of penitence, prayers, and sermons when the condemned would learn their fate. As depicted by the great 19th century artist Francisco Goya, especially in his dark years, who was an eyewitness to the last days of the Spanish Inquisition, the painting shows an act of faith. The condemned, the accused, is on the stage wearing a San Benito with flames indicating he's guilty of heresy to, of course, the crowd assembled around him. In popular consciousness, though, the auto da fe is pictured as an incredible display of temporal and spiritual pageantry, pomp, and display, or power, as seen very famously in Francisco Rizzi's magnificent 1683 painting of the Grand Auto da Fe of 1680, which occurred in the Plaza Mayor of Madrid. The king and the queen are in the central balcony, surrounded by nobles and leading dignitaries. Clergy and other visiting guests are on either side in the apartments. And the two condemned figures in the very middle of the painting, you can see them wearing the San Benito in the prisoner's dock, in the Carroza, the dunce's cap. They're in the extreme center. They're facing thousands of ordinary people situated, the faceless forms, right on the ground below. We can only catch a glimpse of how many people came. This enormous spectacle, by this point, really became once in a lifetime, though drawing tens of thousands of spectators from miles around. So it was entertainment, but it also was kind of a sign to people, this is what happens to heretics. It's an attempt to impress upon the faithful the evils of heresy. Now, for Sephardic Jews, and bringing them into the conversation, right, forcibly converted to Catholicism over centuries, became known as New Christians, Cristianos Nuevos in Spanish, Cristãos Novos in Portuguese, or Conversos, or Moranos, as was usually applied to them. Despite their conversion, though, suspicion remained they were secretly Judaizing, again practicing Jewish traditions and rituals in secret. Jewishness in Iberia thus ceased to be seen as a matter of faith and was effectively racialized. Already at this early time of the early modern era, coming to be seen as transmitted biologically. Iberia developed the limpieza de sangre, the racial purity laws, or purity of blood statutes, as they were known, in the mid-15th century in Toledo, that eventually came to regulate access to professions, even formal admission to military, religious orders, and universities. These discriminatory laws endured for centuries in Spain, Portugal, and their overseas empires around the world. Hence, this is the backdrop against which the Spanish Inquisition had been formed and was operating for a decade and a half when the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella defeated the Muslims at Granada in January 1492. In March, in the Alhambra, as seen here, again, this magnificent citadel and fortress in Granada, Spain, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, all remaining Jews were ordered expelled within, at most, 4 months or 120 days. The Edict of Expulsion, or Alhambra Decree, as seen on the left, was signed by the king and the queen, some other officials, embossed with the royal seal. Debate remains as to how many Sephardim departed, ranging from tens to hundreds of thousands, but we know as a consensus that only half of the Jewish population left. The other half converted to Catholicism under extreme duress, becoming new Christians. And they did this in order to remain in their homeland of 1,500 years. Again, the choice must have been unenviable and excruciating. The final deadline to leave was on or near Tisha B'Av, the great day of lamentation on the Jewish calendar, right, commemorating the tragedies that had befallen the Jewish people through the ages. And Christopher Columbus, scheduled to depart across the Atlantic on August 2nd, on Tisha B'Av, delayed the voyage by 1 day. In his diary, he notes that he saw Jews leaving the ports, and we know that several members of the crew, notably Luis de Torres, the translator, converted to Catholicism in the mere few days preceding the final deadline. And so in some sense, the past and the future of Jewish presence really crossed paths with one another at that singular moment in history. The unity of Sepharad was forever shattered. Half departed the Iberian Peninsula entirely and ventured to the Dar al-Islam, or the Islamic world, in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, controlled by the Ottoman Empire, ruled by Sultan Bayezid II, who welcomed the exiles to settle in his dominions. Many of you know that went again to Thessaloniki or Salonika, Istanbul, Izmir, and those in the Balkans, Monastir, Skopje, Belgrade. The other half of Spanish exiles entered the neighboring kingdom, Portugal, perhaps even more, similar culture, climate, and language. Although Sepharad was recreated in miniature and even, of course, remains to this day in communities around the globe, preserved through memory, language, culture, cuisine, music, Sephardic unity was destroyed and torn asunder. And while Jews had been expelled from England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, there's really nothing comparable I think, in scale or scope to 1492, where again we're talking about tens to hundreds of thousands of people evicted in a matter of months. It was an abrupt cataclysm whose consequences endure today. Less than 5 years after finding refuge in Portugal, right in December of 1496, King Manuel I ordered all Jews to depart the Portuguese dominions and in a bid to wed the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the neighboring Spanish monarchs. And in the spring of 1497, as many of us know, 20,000 Jews or so who wished to depart Portugal arrived in Lisbon seeking ships on which to depart. Instead, Manuel ordered them all baptized. And at once, the entire normative Jewish community disappeared, instantly becoming new Christians. The Portuguese state attempted to extirpate the very memory of Judaism. Synagogues and schools were closed, prayer books, ritual objects confiscated, cemeteries uplifted, and this decree has been described again as a religicide or an annihilation of faith, or at least an attempted annihilation of faith. By the late 15th century, after Navarra also expelled her Jews in 1498, so by 1500, Judaism as a living faith, as a living religion, officially no longer existed in the Iberian Peninsula in the biblical Sepharad. The forcible conversion of 1497, along with the massacre in Lisbon of 2,000 to 4,000 new Christians in April 1506 during Easter and Passover, actually had the opposite of the intended effect. For sanctified principles, however, are not easily discarded. These actions strengthened the resilience of Portuguese new Christians, or many of whom were crypto-Jews, and their ongoing identification with Jewish communities around the world. And again, if anyone wishes to learn more about this massacre of 1506, I recommend a book of fiction, but it's very well done, interesting, The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon by Richard Zimler. Well, King Manuel did not permit the Inquisition to come to Portugal. He died in 1521. His son João III procured a papal bull from Pope Paul III. And you can see the monarch on the right, the Pope on the left, in 1536, authorizing the establishment of an Inquisition in Portugal based on the Spanish model. Although new Christians mounted a spirited campaign against the Inquisition, and they did delay it for some time, the first auto de fe came to Lisbon in 1540. By 1580, when the Iberian Union, a dynastic merger of Spain and Portugal, formed, the borders between these two kingdoms became permeable. Thousands of Portuguese new Christians entered Spain before fleeing Iberia altogether. Crypto-Judaism may have faded in Spain to a much greater extent, right, than Portugal, but it was the Portuguese crypto-Jews who doggedly maintained the faith in Iberia and eventually around the world, changing the course of history. As the maps show, they resuscitated Jewish presence in vast parts of Europe. After previous massacres, expulsions, and conversions, they famously founded Spanish and Portuguese synagogues in communities in major cities, including Amsterdam, Bayonne, Bordeaux, Hamburg, London, and rejoined former co-religionists in the Italian peninsula and the Ottoman Empire. They accompanied or followed soon upon the travels of Iberian explorers, Christopher Columbus, Pedro Álvares Cabral, Ferdinand Magellan. The Iberian new Christians journeyed in large numbers and settled throughout the New World, of course where we are, ranging from Mexico and Central America to Brazil and the Caribbean, including Suriname, Jamaica, Barbados, and Curacao. By reverting to Judaism and founding communities and places of worship, they followed the established pattern already seen in parts of Europe. Spanish crypto-Jews found refuge in New Spain, including Mexico, Florida, the American Southwest. Portuguese crypto-Jews established synagogues along the eastern seaboard of North America, again, including Montreal, Canada, Newport, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia. In 1654, 23 Jews fleeing the Portuguese Inquisition as former new Christians from Recife or Recife, Brazil, right, arrived in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, founded Congregation Shereth Israel, viewed as the birth of American Jewish history. And when the English conquered the colony in 1664, they changed the city's name to New York. Not content to watch this global spread of heresy continue, the Inquisitions in Spain and Portugal established subsidiary tribunals in their colonies in Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and India, encircling all their colonies. And you can see the jurisdiction of the Inquisition went around the world, ranging from the Philippines to Mexico, so across the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic world to Africa, Brazil to the future United States, including Louisiana. Crypto-Jews, including Luis de Carvajal Almozo, Francisco Maldonado da Silva, Isaac de Castro Tardis. They died in the Law of Moses, burnt alive again in these autos de fe, staged in public fora around the world, the major cities of Mexico City, Lima, and Lisbon. Far from eradicating a crypto-Jewish identity, inquisitorial persecution played a key role in ensuring that crypto-Jews remained attached to their former faith, traditions, and people. In Iberia and these colonies, right, daily discourse, landscape, mental universe were permeated with Catholic imagery. And lacking sustained connection with normative Jewish communities to, again, a great extent, a converso religious world was created, its own calendar, customs, and beliefs shaped by the wider Catholic milieu. Yet inquisitorial records, oral traditions, and the return of descendants to Judaism even today, over the last few centuries, argues a genuine attachment to tradition, ritual, memory continued in the hearts of generations who were deprived of access to their ancestral Jewish faith. Our repugnance at the Inquisition today, I think, is not only due to the number of victims, which we're talking 200,000-300,000 people, nor even the geographical or temporal scope of the persecution, the 3.5 centuries on 5 continents, though that certainly forms part of the story. The greatest repugnance, I think, at this institution, at this tribunal, is the core objective of the Inquisition, as remarked upon even by some contemporaries. It's abhorrent due to utilization of bureaucratic procedures and hideous techniques to inquire into the individual's conscience and punish them for nonconformity to prevailing societal norms and beliefs. This condemnation of menticide, right, a extirpation of free thought, an attempt to destroy the mind, arguably found its supreme expression in the Enlightenment across 17th and 18th century Europe. Now, the Enlightenment was a movement of thought and belief developed from interrelated conceptions of God, reason, nature, and man. And its dominant conviction was that right reasoning could find true knowledge and could lead humanity to felicity or happiness. Centered around the image of light, which found its way into all of Europe's main languages, the Enlightenment influenced continental-wide debates over economic policies, penal reform, human confidence and progress and rationality. And to devotees, many of whom were deists, right, they did not believe necessarily God intervened in human affairs. The Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions increasingly came to be seen as anachronistic and barbaric. They didn't believe in this age of progress, or it didn't belong in this time. This age of reason saw calls for greater liberty, as Lord Acton famously said, this is the assurance that every man shall be protected in doing what he believes his duty against the influence of authority and majorities, custom and opinion. The mid and late 17th century saw the beginnings of this ideal actually materialize, especially in the New World. Barbados, at this time an English island in the Caribbean, already adopted a policy of liberty of conscience in the 1640s and was described in 1655 by a visitor as, quote, inhabited with all sorts, English, French, Dutch, Scots, Irish, and Spaniards, they being crypto-Jews. In 1662, the then English colony Suriname's assembly proclaimed liberty of conscience to all that shall live peaceably under government in the land. And in 1665, the governor and assembly granted Jews full freedom of worship and status as English subjects. In 1660, following the death of Oliver Cromwell, the end of the interregnum, right, the restoration of the monarchy, King Charles II ascended the throne. And in 1663, he issued a charter for Roger Williams' new colony, Rhode Island, which explicitly guaranteed religious freedom in the charter. In 1681, Charles II granted a similar charter for Pennsylvania under the leadership of William Penn. This same time saw growing scholarly support for diversity of beliefs. The Calvinist philosopher and refugee Pierre Bayle published his Commentaire philosophique, which addressed the crucial issue of forced conversion, rejecting all arguments in favor of persecution of heresy. In England, the political philosopher John Locke, who helped to draft the fundamental constitutions of Carolina before, of course, they split into North and South, composed his famous letter concerning toleration. Believing that coercion in religious matters was illegitimate, he called for separation of church and state and wrote that, quote, neither pagan nor Muslim nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion. These changes in the intellectual milieu declared the new age, again, of reason, aptly symbolized by the 1687 publication of Sir Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, which expounded his laws of motion and universal gravitation, forever altering our worldview. And this is also the lifetime of Baruch Spinoza, the Dutch Jewish philosopher, son of former Portuguese New Christians who came to Amsterdam, whose revolutionary conception of the deity radically clashed with traditional Jewish notions. He also called for a separation of church and state, greater importance on freedom of thought, and protections accorded to the individual. While these works impacted public opinion, the decisive turning point within the Catholic world appears to have come in the mid-18th century, thanks to Montesquieu, the great philosopher, and Voltaire. Montesquieu, who championed separation of powers, who greatly influenced the founders of the United States, famously reacted in his spirit of laws, l'esprit des lois, in 1748 to the burning at the stake of an 18-year-old girl with the most eloquent denunciation of the Inquisition as seen here. He predicted that if anyone in times to come shall dare to assert that in the age in which we live, the people of Europe were civilized, you will be cited to prove that they were barbarians, and the idea they will have of you will dishonor your age. His work denounced violence and torture as contrary to the religious spirit, the rights of man, but it's probably his contemporary and fellow countryman Voltaire, the esteemed French philosopher, who did most in his voluminous writings to fix the image of the dreaded tribunal in contemporary memory. In Italy, Cesare Beccaria's work on crimes and punishments, published in 1764, condemned torture, testimony of secret witnesses, and the principle of guilty until proven innocent. This document found its way throughout the transatlantic republic of letters, including North America. And this same time period saw marked changes even within the Iberian Peninsula. In Portugal, the Marquês de Pombal, the effective prime minister, the de facto prime minister, constrained the independence of the tribunal, abolished the auto de fe and limpieza de sangre racial purity laws. He even temporarily halted the Inquisition's activities in Goa in India, although he couldn't outright abolish the Inquisition during his time. But he did promulgate 1774 regimentos, which abolished secrecy of procedure, so that denunciations had to be presented to the prisoners with names of the witnesses and details of the place and time of the alleged crime. Carlos III, King of Spain from 1759 to 1788, was a strong proponent of the Enlightenment. He relaxed censorship of the press. He curbed some of the Spanish Inquisition's authority. He even invited Jews to return to Sicily, from whence they had been expelled in 1492-93 due to the Edict of Expulsion, although, of course, very few took him up on that offer. In 1779, during his reign, John Adams, a future American president, visited Spain en route to France to solicit help for the American Revolution. And Adams asked, in his own diary, he describes this, a Spanish official about the tribunal. And according to Adams' own words, the Spaniard replied, quote, "The Inquisition in Spain was grown much milder and had lost much of its influence. Europe in general was much enlightened and had grown more moderate, and public opinion in Spain revolted against the cruelties of the Inquisition. Liberty of conscience was thus the epitome of this unique zeitgeist, marked by revolutionary upheaval on both sides of the Atlantic, which lasted through the Napoleonic era, and it found its ultimate manifestation in the American experiment to which we turn." Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, the last of the original 13 English colonies on the mainland of North America, were three prominent examples which built on Enlightenment principles of freedom of thought and worship. Sephardic crypto-Jews seeking respite from inquisitorial oppression arrived as refugees, forming congregations all along, again, the eastern seaboard, which endure to this day. Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, his lively experiment, he termed it, hoped that one day Jews and Gentiles could live together, strongly believing, quote, "forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." And he wrote, "It is against Christianity and civil justice for the civil state to permit to some the freedom of their consciences and worships, but to curb and suppress the consciences and souls of all others. Is not this to set up a Spanish Inquisition in all parts of the world, which will lead to the speedy destruction of millions of souls?" William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania and the city of brotherly love, better known as Philadelphia, similarly declared that no people can be truly happy if abridged of the freedom of their conscience. He starkly contrasted his colony's commitment to religious liberty, what he termed his holy experiment. So Roger Williams had to have the lively experiment, William Penn has the holy experiment, and Penn contrasted the holy experiment with inquisitorial persecution of heretics and dissenters. In February 1733, General James Oglethorpe established the colony of Georgia, centered on the city of Savannah. Shortly thereafter, an epidemic broke out, killing colonists. 5 months later, in the midst of the ongoing outbreak, about 40 Jewish immigrants, the vast majority of whom were of Portuguese origin, with a few Ashkenazim, arrived from London aboard the ship the William and Sarah, the largest group of Jews to land in North America in colonial days. brought with them a Torah scroll on deerskin which dates from 15th century Iberia. Among this group was Dr. Samuel Nunez Ribeiro and his family, who had fled to London after having been arrested and imprisoned by the Portuguese Inquisition on charges of Judaizing. The doctor's arrival and medical assistance in Savannah was timely, for the colony's only physician had died. After Nunez arrested the outbreak, Oglethorpe permitted the Jews to remain and even gave them land on a completely equal basis with the other settlers. They then founded Congregation Mikveh Israel, or the Hope of Israel, in Savannah, the oldest Jewish congregation in the American South, which just celebrated its 290th anniversary last year. It's the third oldest congregation in the United States, and its museum proudly preserves the Torah scroll from 15th century Iberia to this day. And last year, when I spoke there, I had the great honor to see it. They brought it out for its anniversary. When the Spanish even landed, as a final thought, at St. Simon's Island off the coast of Georgia in the War of Jenkins' Ear, something we hear about in school, but we never know what it really means, the Sephardic Jews, as former New Christians in the city, fled Savannah, fearing the arrival of the Inquisition and their condemnation as apostates from Catholicism. The two Ashkenazi families stayed in the city to maintain a Jewish presence, and their descendants live there to this day. I also had the pleasure of meeting them at the event. Half a century later, the American Revolution occurred, with the colonists proclaiming independence on July 4th, 1776. Although Enlightenment ideas migrated from the old world to the new, the concretized example traveled from west to east, eventually inspiring the French Revolution and others across Europe. And though the United States became a new nation by 1783, the Treaty of Paris, governing it remained problematic. Conflicts over the extent of liberty of conscience even occurred in the nascent republic. One of the greatest struggles actually occurred in the newly independent Commonwealth of Virginia in 1784. The state legislature debated a bill to levy a tax to fund Christian religious instruction. James Madison, a future president and later known as father of the Constitution, led the opposition in the assembly. And he authored a work, Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, which explicitly connected this bill to the Inquisition. He wrote, "The religion of every man must be left to the conscience of every man. Distant as this may be in its present form from the Inquisition, it differs from it only in degree. The one is the first step, the other the last in the career of intolerance." The legislature defeated this proposed bill in 1785, and in 1786 adopted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, authored by Thomas Jefferson. "Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free," the document begins, "a landmark law in the history of the liberty of conscience, no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship whatsoever, but all men shall be free to profess their opinions in matters of religion." This 1786 law enshrined not merely religious toleration, but liberty of conscience. Today, parts of it, excerpts of it, are inscribed on the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., so I highly recommend visiting it if you get the chance. Madison wrote to Jefferson after passage of this bill, then serving as U.S. ambassador to France. So Jefferson wasn't even present. Madison shepherded the bill through the assembly, and Madison wrote to Jefferson, quote, "I flatter myself that we have in this country extinguished forever the ambitious project of making laws for the human mind." Contemporaneous with this debate in Virginia, James Oglethorpe, who lived long enough to witness this, met with John Adams, the then U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. Dying a few weeks later, the 88-year-old founder of Georgia expressed great esteem and regard for the emerging American Republic and its attendant values, which built on his own impressive legacy of religious freedom. Against this historical background, 55 men from 12 of the 13 American colonies gathered in Philadelphia, in Penn's city of brotherly love, to formulate a new governing framework in the summer of 1787. The men who became the founding fathers were thus cognizant of the significance of religious freedom and of procedural rights enshrined in many state constitutions already. Right? The states formed the federal government. Although they were different from one another in education, ability, experience, and political philosophy, they were without exception dedicated to seeing the American experiment succeed. The founders drew upon this past, their wealth of knowledge, and their own experiences. During the convention, the delegates received a single private petition requesting the new Constitution ensure liberty of conscience for Jews, and by implication, all religious minorities. It was written by Jonas Phillips, a Revolutionary War veteran, a founder of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Philadelphia, Mikveh Israel, which endures to this day. He was Ashkenazi, I have to add, and husband of Rebecca Mendes Machado, whose parents were Portuguese crypto-Jews, and whose uncle was burnt at the stake, according to family legend. While Phillips was unaware that religious tests for federal office had already been prohibited in Article 6 of the new Constitution, already a landmark by the founders, his letter certainly, I think, presaged a broader debate in state conventions over the creation of a Bill of Rights to explicitly guarantee individual rights. And in the Virginia State Convention, Patrick Henry, who famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death," argued that with no Bill of Rights, Congress, quote, may introduce the practice of France, Spain, Germany, of torturing to extort a confession of the crime. If this happens, we are then lost and undone. The absence of a Bill of Rights led Abraham Holmes, a delegate to the Massachusetts Convention, to explicitly ask, quote, whether the criminal is to be allowed benefit of counsel, to meet his accuser face to face, to confront the witnesses, and to have the advantage of cross-examination. Without procedural protections for the accused, he predicted that one day the United States Congress could even empower courts to become, quote, like a certain tribunal in Spain, which has long been the disgrace of Christendom. I mean that diabolical institution, the Inquisition. In the midst of these debates, George Washington became the first president of the United States. At his inauguration in April 1789 in New York, 14 clergymen participated, including Gershom Mendes Seixas of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, or Congregation Shereth Israel. In August 1790, Washington wrote his landmark letter to the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, and this synagogue is named for Isaac Touro, the father of Judah, the prominent citizen and benefactor of New Orleans. And in this letter, of course, Washington assures the children of the stock of Abraham that, quote, all citizens possess alike liberty of conscience, an inherent natural right, for happily the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. In December 1791, I should have changed it, but you get the quote here. In December of 1791, the U.S. Bill of Rights was ratified by the states, becoming the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The First Amendment famously enshrined liberty of conscience in speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. Other amendments guaranteed core procedural protections for the defendant in criminal cases, including due process, no confiscation of private property without just compensation, a speedy and public trial, an impartial jury. The accused was to have the right to confront adverse witnesses, compel them to appear in court, to have the assistance of counsel. Past practices of compelled self-incrimination and cruel and unusual punishment were prohibited. Accordingly, from the time of George Washington, from the founding of the Republic, constitutional protections for liberty of conscience and the accused were placed at the very center of the American political and legal tradition. In 1803, I might add, and probably should add, President Thomas Jefferson purchased Louisiana Territory from France, then led by Napoleon. And from a legal perspective, a fundamental transformation occurred. The 1685 Code Noir of Louis XIV, which regulated the life, death, purchase, religion, and treatment of slaves by their masters in all French colonies, had governed Louisiana since 1724. Although it was rarely enforced in Louisiana, in the territory, Article 1 of the Code declared Jews, quote, enemies of the Christian name, and ordered them all expelled from French colonies under threat of punishment, while Article 3 expressly permitted Catholicism as the sole legitimate religion. In 1757, the first Sephardic Jew, Dutch-born Isaac Monsanto, of a Portuguese New Christian family, arrived in New Orleans, becoming a successful merchant. When the Spanish acquired the territory in 1762, the Mexican Inquisition came, and Monsanto was expelled from the city, relocating to British Florida. When the U.S. Senate ratified the Louisiana Purchase in October 1803, the Code Noir was officially ended, and the First Amendment's protection of religious liberty instantly covered the newly acquired 800,000 acres. Monsanto's descendant, I must add too, Olga Mendes Monsanto, married John Francis Queeny of Chicago, who relocated to St. Louis and founded the Monsanto Company in 1901, acquired by Bayer in 2018. This dedication to liberty of conscience continued throughout the lives of the founders, as seen in their correspondence. In May 1818, Mordecai Manuel Noah, a jurist, former U.S. consul to Tunis, grandson of Jonas Phillips, who penned the letter to the convention, and great-grandson of Dr. Samuel Nunez Ribeiro, who saved the colony of Savannah, wrote to Thomas Jefferson thanking the former president for his dedication to religious liberty, especially for Jewish Americans. Noah observed that, quote, "The example which our country has set now operates favorably in Europe, and the Jews are attaining consequence and distinction abroad." A few weeks later, Jefferson thanked Noah for his remarks, noting that the oppression of the Jewish people, quote, "furnished a remarkable proof of the universal spirit of religious intolerance. Our laws have applied," Jefferson observed, "the only antidote to this vice, but more remains to be done. For although we are free by the law, we are not so in practice. Public opinion erects itself into an inquisition and exercises its office with as much fanaticism as fans the flames of an auto-da-fe." That same year witnessed the final crypto-Jew, Manuel Santiago Vivar, hauled before the Spanish Inquisition. In August 1820, former President James Madison wrote to Dr. Jacob de la Mota, the child of Sephardic Jews from St. Croix in the then Danish West Indies, today's U.S. Virgin Islands, and a leading physician in Charleston, South Carolina. De la Mota delivered a eulogy for Gershom Mendes Satius, Sheriff Israel, the rabbi or the minister at the time who had given a benediction at Washington's inauguration. And Madison wrote, quote, "The history of the Jews must forever be interesting. The modern part of it is so little generally known that every ray of light on the subject has its value. Among the features peculiar to the political system of the United States is the perfect equality of rights which it secures to every religious sect, and it's particularly pleasing to observe in the good citizenship of Jews a happy illustration of the safety and success of this experiment of a just policy." In January 1825, 18 months before their deaths, John Adams, the second president, wrote to Thomas Jefferson, the third president, saying, quote, "We think ourselves possessed, or at least we boast, that we are so of liberty of conscience on all subjects, and yet how far are we from these exalted privileges? In fact, in most countries of Europe, blasphemy is punished by fire at the stake or the rack or the wheel. I think such laws a great embarrassment and great obstructions to the improvement of the human mind." In March 1826, Jefferson composed his own last will and testament, including his own epitaph. His political roles as governor of Virginia, Secretary of State, Vice President, and even President did not warrant a mention. He wished to be remembered only as author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, and author of the foundational document that bridged the birth of the Republic and enshrined freedom of thought and conscience, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. The age of the founders and the Iberian Inquisition was nearly over, and with it came a momentous era in the annals of history. The Portuguese Inquisition was abolished in March 1821. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. 3 weeks later, the final victim of the Spanish Inquisition was executed, though the tribunal itself was not formally abolished until July 1834. The last living founder, James Madison, former president, father of the Constitution, and author of the Bill of Rights, survived just long enough to see the Inquisition come to an end. With his death in June 1836, the founders belonged to the ages, leaving their contributions to be preserved by the Republic. It has been estimated that 200,000 people stood trial, again in the vast scope of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition's history. 1.5 million interacted to some extent with one of these tribunals over the course, again, of 3.5 centuries on 5 continents. It seems to me that one of the Inquisition's most paradoxical and enduring legacies was its impact upon a new republic in the New World, which defied the course of history to preserve liberty of conscience for all, including heretics and Jews. The founders were not perfect men, yet their extraordinary commitment to freedom of conscience and religion enshrined in America's founding history and documents was likely motivated in part by their genuine abhorrence of the Inquisition's repugnant tactics, methods, and very existence. Inquisitorial practices, especially relating to interrogations and confessions, are cited throughout the jurisprudence of the United States Supreme Court. Fear of the Inquisition played a role in crafting and interpreting constitutional provisions for liberty of conscience and protections for the accused. As the Supreme Court expressed it in the 1940 case Chambers versus Florida, which, by the way, was argued by a 31-year-old Thurgood Marshall, his very first case before the Supreme Court, the testimony of centuries is proof that physical and mental torture and coercion, the rack, the wheel, protracted questioning have left in their wake mutilated bodies and shattered minds. We are all only a few generations removed in memory from those unenviable days. In other words, as U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, the chief American prosecutor at the 1945 Nuremberg trials, wrote, in West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett in 1943, in the midst of World War II and the Holocaust, quote, those who begin coercive elimination of dissent soon find themselves exterminating dissenters. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. Countless generations may pass, yet as long as men and women remain free to invoke the blessings of liberty, think, say, and worship according to their conscience, and can call upon the procedural guarantees of the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights painstakingly acquired over centuries, the Inquisition's shadow, and perhaps even its very ghost, lives on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have a pretty amount of time for questions, so I'd like to open the floor to see if anyone has any questions.
So I have a question about, Sephardic heritage culture surrounding, let's say, synagogues in the United States, because it strikes me that, your talk was so amazing in that it really linked, the earliest synagogues in the United States to the persecution of supposedly the new Christian or crypto Jews who had fled from either Spain or Portugal. And I just wonder, to what degree is this linking or interlinking of history part of, I guess, more public Sephardic history in the US, especially around these very early, synagogues that we all maybe learn about in our modern Hebrew books, but we don't know the context. So I don't know. Can you speak to that?
It's a very good question. I think it is a part of public history. I am shocked, and I'll also let Jesus answer, our other speaker over the past couple of days here, see his thoughts. But I think that it's true. Many people don't know that these synagogues were founded. Everyone has probably heard of New York. I would imagine. Rhode Island. I didn't even get to mention. Savannah is very proud that actually they're the first letter. They sent the first letter of any synagogue to Washington. They actually precede the Newport letter. It's just the Newport letter is so significant because Washington makes that declaration, right, that liberty of conscience is an inherent natural right, which it just builds in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. So that's something new. It's now just no longer religious toleration, it's actual liberty of conscience. So I think that it is part of public history. I don't know really anyone else who's been focusing on trying to bridge this, but this is where I come from as a lawyer and legal historian who tries to see these patterns, and just found it fascinating that there's such an overlap, not just kind of in the ideas, but also the times. As I said, the founders seem to die at the same time the Inquisitions lasted, which just gives you, I think, a mind-boggling sense of how long the Inquisitions lasted. They're founded in the 1400s, 1500s, and they're going all the way until 200 years ago, when the founders lived. So I think there's a great need for this, and there's more willingness, I think, to learn about it. And I should have, if everything goes according to plan, and things rarely do, it seems, I should have a forthcoming law review article on this in the summer. So we're going to get the Torah Law Review. So I'm doing my best to try to get this out there and promote this. Jesus, do you want to add anything?
No, I completely agree. This is not part of the Sephardic history in the United States. Most of the Sephardic history of the United States deals with immigration in the 20th century, mostly, right? They completely, I wouldn't say ignore, but in many cases they don't know about this part of the Sephardic history in the United States. Okay, it's completely diluted into the history of American founders and the history of the United States, but you don't find mentions to this singularity of Sephardic Jews, interacting or participating in the level of ideas in the main documents of the American
Yeah,
democracy.
it seems that there's a real contribution to U.S. constitutional history, as
Exactly.
you just showed, and that seems to be a complete lacuna, right?
Exactly.
So I really hope that your article is going to delve into this, and then maybe more research will be done on this
Oh,
topic.
for sure. I'd like to do more research too. A few people ask me if I'd ever write a book on it. You know, I mean, certainly the material there. And I'll tell you, it's interesting too. There's a guy who wrote an article, I think I cited at Stanford, I don't know if he's still there, but he wrote the article entitled Anti-Inquisitorialism. And he speaks about that, it kind of permeates jurisprudence. But fascinatingly, he then says there's no evidence to suggest the founders were aware of the Inquisition. Which now, putting it together, I mean, the only thing, to be generous, I understood is maybe, yes, the founders kind of bought into the legend, right, the Protestant kind of calumnies against the Inquisition, that it was just more exaggerated, more horrific than it was. Like, everyone's being executed, everyone's being tortured, which is not true, right? I mean, obviously, it's not like every single person is being burned at the stake. But the fact is, it did happen. You know, Joseph Perez, the great Spanish historian, put it. You know, how many people need to be burnt at the stake in order to condemn it? And the fact that this tribunal was obsessed with inquiring into the mind of people, and then there are no procedural protections for the accused, is what I think condemns it, as I said, for us today.
We've come very close, though, with Inquisitions. What happened to the witches in the 1690s are the accused witches. And then HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, well, there are tendencies nowadays when certain people in Congress want to persecute other people, and some conservative Protestant fundamentalists and extremely conservative Protestant evangelicals, as well as conservative Catholics, say we have to restore Christianity, you know, do away with division of church and state, and the only way our country will prosper if we reestablish the Christian religion. It will be a very authoritarian form if they're going the way they're going.
I'm sure about that. You know, the irony is, I mean, I do, of course, strongly believe in this thesis, and I want to hope I've marshaled and presented evidence to support it. But my doctoral dissertation in law, funny enough, argued that, kind of goes to your point. I didn't mention HUAC or Salem witch trials. Well, maybe I mentioned it because it's interesting that concept of the pen forte door, where they would impress the stones upon the person to suffocate them, to force them to plead, which in a sense is maybe no different than, and that's in common law. You know, the English utilized that for centuries. That maintaining a fiction they never tortured, that's like a continental, you know, thing. And we know that's not true, but my thesis says, really, for everything that we say, and as much as there's a fear of the Inquisition, I think that law by its very nature is inquisitorial. In criminal law in particular, criminal justice system, there's not another way to do it. The US criminal justice system may be the most decentralized version of an inquisition that we have. Maybe that's possible, but it's still, in a sense, at its core, an inquiry. It's still an inquisition of sorts into what did someone think, what did they know. Their mens rea is very important in criminal law.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this history. I was not aware of it, but it's just fascinating. And I'm just curious, you mentioned, like, you know, this other professor wrote this article and said, oh, well, there's not really evidence. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about your process of like I don't know, going into the archives. How do you like started, you know, like because this I assume that you like had to like dig, you know, into documents to find your evidence and all this. So what does that process looks like a little bit, like just
Well, a lot
the
of
research,
it,
I guess, the archival.
so sure. I mean, a lot of it, you know, it's not like it came overnight. I mean,
Yeah.
there is a lot of research and the time and the effort that goes in. I mean, you know, my undergraduate thesis was on the Spanish Inquisition. So with David Gitlitz is one of my, you know, mentors I reached out to, and he assisted me. So I mean, I was already intrigued in my undergraduate days by the Spanish Inquisition. And then, of course, being descended from Sephardic Jews, my dad's side, and my dad's here with me from St. Louis, so very nice. So it always made me wonder, you know, about it. And my grandfather would tell me stories, a little bit of the memory, Inquisition, really the expulsion. But so there's, from a formative age, I was really into what is the Inquisition, what is that like? Most people don't know anything about it. They maybe heard of it, and especially thanks to Mel Brooks' History of the World Part 1. And so I kind of had a foundation of sorts on the Inquisition, and my advisor was Mark Pettis, big scholar on the Inquisition, as I was telling Denise. So I kind of already have had 10 years, 12 years, and a sense of the foundation there. So then I went to law school, so it's WashU all the way. I went to WashU, so I had a core analysis of an inquisitorial trial. And then I went into, and I enjoy legal history quite a bit, and again, these protections in our Constitution. So just, where did they get this from? How did it arise? So I was reading early, again, reading biographies of the founders, which are popular, but there is something there. And it's, undoubtedly there is a strong commitment to religious liberty. Now, we say it's maybe a reaction to excesses from England or Great Britain, and that's true. But I think the Inquisition is really the epitome of spiritual tyranny, to most of them. And so this is really now thanks to digital humanities, the digitization of correspondence. I went to Library of Congress, then I wrote my doctoral dissertation. I went to Library of Congress. I got to see some of the trials, not from the Inquisition, but the Star Chamber, the English Star Chamber, which is inquisitorial-esque, that lasted for centuries too, that would eventually, force people to plead without telling them what the charges were. This also influenced the founders. And in the Miranda opinion, Chief Justice Warren explicitly cites the trial of this guy, John Milburn, who was like 24, funny enough, the same age as Spinoza when he's excommunicated. And so I got to see the original documents, but so much has been digitized now and placed online. There's a whole website called founders.gov. They have scanned all the papers of Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. Type in a search term. Type in Inquisition, it pulls up every letter they wrote that mentions the term. I think Alexander Hamilton as well. And then that just led me, oh, okay, so he mentions public opinion erects itself into an Inquisition. And what's that context? Who did he write it to? It's not necessarily relevant for today, but it's interesting that you can see throughout their lifetimes, and give you a chronological kind of, beginning and end. So they already mentioned the Inquisition in the 1760s, 70s, and they're writing all the way into the 1820s. And this, it's not like every letter has it, but when they talk about it, it's like constantly there, ever present throughout it. And so it's just been kind of a process of saying, oh, it's in their correspondence. Then I went to look at the Constitutional Convention and the debates, and you look at the Federalist Papers, and I started going through it, and I said, oh, they mentioned it here too. So it's just kind of been this process, but thankfully I don't have to go to Spain or Portugal in order to go in those archives and say, what did they say, 400 years ago on this? I mean, I guess is the beauty of the United States being a relatively young country, and in English, I must add too. That's nice. But it's been a long process, and it's just trying to form my thoughts around this and saying we have this document, this document, this document, and just trying to lay it all out and put it together. It's still an ongoing work, of course, but I hope it's the beginning of a greater acceptance and greater awareness of this.
I would like to follow up on this because I feel as though this discussion is really getting to this question of the extent to which there's a memory of this among Sephardic communities in the U.S., even communities that are based in these very old Sephardic synagogues, and how impressive, how important this role is, and the question of sort of citizenship, which was one of the main topics, right, that we wanted to be exploring, which we haven't had that much opportunity to actually talk that much about. But this, I'm talking citizenship within the U.S. and this question of this fundamental role played by the memory of the Inquisition and hence by crypto-Jews.
I'll tell you something that's interesting, and again, I'll let Jesus want to chime in on this as well. The very first act of the first Congress, the 1790 Naturalization Act, okay, people look at America, the founding, through the lens of race, and there is something to be said for that. But we could also look at it through the lens of religion, and particularly religious liberty. That same Naturalization Act that limits citizenship to white people has no religious litmus test. The very first Congress that makes that. So it's fascinating. I mean, that commitment to religious liberty exists alongside kind of, acceptance of slavery by many of them, or an unwillingness to kind of go through.
What's the year of the naturalization?
1790. It's the first Congress. So people want to say, oh, you see, they already limited it to white men. Yeah, but there's no religious test at all. So Jews can become citizens right away. Protestants can't, any Christian denomination. In fact, the other thing I think it decided, one of the opponents of don't know if it's the Virginia statute or it might be I think it's actually the amendments that Madison drafted 12 amendments as part of the Bill of Rights. The states didn't accept 2 of them. One of them was later ratified in 1992, so over 200 years later, about compensation. But one of them he thought the most important was the conscience protection. But this one version he added, he would have had a much broader understanding of conscience than what made it into the final draft. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, about the 1790. But one of the things he says is, why shouldn't we have a society where heathen, Jew, Turk, which is of course synonym for Muslim, can eventually come to occupy the highest office in the land? And there's a lot of opposition to that. He says this is the type of society we want to build.
So I have another more sociological question. This may sound okay. All right. So how do you explain the kind of like fanatic, insane fervor to not only persecute, the Jewish people in Iberia after basically stealing the Hebrew Bible, stealing a lot of, Jewish rituals for Catholicism, right? The kind of like, and then, basically trying to eliminate these communities that are being perceived as a clear threat, maybe religious competition, potentially success in terms of commerce, right? And then not only expelling them or converting them, but then going after the conversos, right? I mean, the kind of like degree of paranoia and mania and fear and anxiety that is projected onto the Jewish people as threatening the hegemony of the Catholics, right? And their institutions is really verging on, it seems like there's an entire profound mental illness, syndrome going on there. How do you explain that complete, insane, fundamentalist fanaticism? Because there is no other way to say this. And these spectacles that are being put in place and showcased, really, what's up with that?
And could I do a friendly amendment, as it were?
Yeah.
Because I'm also really interested, as you pointed out, that the Inquisition and the inquisitorial declarations maintained Judaism effectively by publicizing Jewish practices. And so you have this, exactly,
Right.
as though it were about exterminating, and you have this that seems to be about preserving, right?
As an unintended sort of like...
But maybe, really unintended? Or like, do you have to have a Jewish... a presence, a crypto-Jewish presence.
Yeah, if we were Hegelian, right? So I'm sorry to be putting it like this, but in order to define oneself, you always need to have another to negate, right? So, and you can only constitute yourself in your Catholicism if you basically negate the Jewish. You can do an entire Hegelian dialectic on this, but the question is, how do you explain that? We'd be both interested in hearing your sociological perspective, or also maybe history of religion perspective. And Jesus, I'm sure you have.
Yeah, Jesus, what was that?
To say on that.
That's the 1 million question, right?
Sorry,
That's the 1 million questions, because it's something that is irrelevant even today, right? And I think this is from the Inquisition perspective. I think it was mainly church politics at that time. There was an alliance between the Pope and the Spanish kings in order to make Catholicism the religion of the land at that time. So they were specifically, we were talking about that in our breakfast. There were a specific economical, not only religious, but
economics. That's right.
Economics,
yeah.
set concepts there that we're working. We were commenting on how at that time the church was also a corporation, right? The church at that time was a corporation. The church had land. They owned people. They owned slaves also when they came to the Americas. So the church was a corporation. So there was not only religious issues, there were obviously religious issues, right? But there were also very economical issues. Even today, the church in Spain is one of the major property honor in the country.
Same in Germany, by the way.
Same in Germany, same in Europe in general, right? So there is this connection. Maybe I really like your presentation, by the way. Really like it because it connects law
By the way.
and yes, because it connects the law and the hidden influence of the Inquisition mentality into what will be the United States in opposition precisely to the totalitarian mentality, right?
Yeah.
Of the kingdom and the church and all of that. So the United States, that's the selling point for the American democracy. Is to be the opposite to the Inquisition mentality.
Yeah.
I really like the word menticide, right? Because at the end of the day, they even can live the body, but they couldn't live the mind, to continue practicing Judaism. That was terrible. That was really the point for them.
But do you think it's the corporate thing, that the corporate history of the church that fueled that? I mean, this is almost, I hate to say this is pre-Nazi, right? And I was also thinking
we were talking about that precisely.
of the purity laws, then getting imported and moving from the religious into the, theopolitics, right,
Yeah.
of Nazi Germany, right? So, but, I mean, what's up with, you have to find every last Jew to kill them? Do you know what I mean? It's a little bit compulsive, obsessive.
I don't know if you
I
were-
like to call it a pathological obsession.
Yeah,
I don't know
It's-
if you were in the first conversation that we had the other day, and how the Spanish kings follow the Jews everywhere they were.
Yeah.
They say to Manuel, the kingdom of Portugal, okay, if you want to marry our daughter, you have to spare the Jews.
Yeah,
And that's what he did. He had to do it in order to,
Right.
to marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel. But at the same time, he did it. But at the same time, he did a very, light forced conversion. And he said, we don't talk about this in 20 years, right? So he had to do it, but he did it in a way in which he could even maintain all the population in their kingdoms, because they brought with them the arts, economics, the how to do things, philosophy, and the Portuguese king, they wanted to have that in Spain, because in Portugal they had Jews, but it was less than in Spain. Spain was really the main house for Jews at the time. So the Portuguese king said, okay, come here, right? So, but I think at the end of the day, this have to be, research a little bit more. But at the end of the day, I think that is an economical aspect of the church at the time. They were investing in land, and they were investing in people and in properties.
But also, it seems like that there is this potential, social cachet philosopher. I don't know. There's this intellectual, and do you know what I mean? It's really about controlling, because you were mentioning, so the Jewish people were the artists, they were the philosophers, these
Yeah.
free thinkers, and
I was just going to add that, it is a subject of historiographical debate, what was the religious identity, obviously on one hand of them, how did they self-identify, but also what was the motivating impulse of the Inquisition, and, is it really motivated by a genuine desire to purify from a religious perspective? Is it the economic thing? Saraiva, Antonio Saraiva makes that in his book, The Murano Factory.
Mhm.
There were no crypto-Jews. The Inquisition manufactured them completely, hence it was a factory for economic purposes, to confiscate the wealth of a
That's right.
burgeoning middle class. But on the other hand, then there's the racial component that Netanyahu makes, and no doubt it refracted Galagos. I think in a sense it might be everything. It's hard to find, as Marcel Mauss would say, total social fact. I don't think there's anything explanation that can account for every single iteration.
Isn't it the problem, though, that of the organic state, or the organic society versus pluralistic state and the pluralistic society? Isabella and Ferdinand wanted an organic state. Well, that means the political, the social, the economic, the religious, and the cultural are all bound up in one ball of wax or whatever. And it's a problem for us. It's not a problem for them because they think they're right. There's one God, one king, one faith, one religion.
Yeah, but it goes to that too, is that for some people, religion is an incredibly powerful motivator. A genuine faith, even misplaced, can really compel people to do things that they may not otherwise have done. And sometimes it's difficult, I think, for people in our time, in a more secularized age, to really understand the power that religion can command, that still can command in some places, but certainly for many people in that time.
Well, it's the organic state. There can't be an alternative truth.
Right.
There's one truth,
Right.
and the Catholic faith epitomizes this one truth. And so it makes, and as you go along from Ferdinand and Isabella down to their grandson Charles V and his son Philip II, it gets harder and harder, and it moves from an authoritarian state to a totalitarian state. It's like, in secular terms, Russia under Stalin, 1936, 1937, 1938, the show trials before World War II.
Right.
There can't be an alternative truth. It's socialism. We have to eradicate the counter-revolutionaries in capitalism.
And going to that too, the show trials, that's so important to demonstrate to the public. It's the auto-da-fe all over again in a sense. And recently too, the Einsatzgruppen in the Holocaust, those SS death squads. Everyone talks about the Holocaust in many places done in secret, arguably more true in Western Europe. The deportations are occurring, but no one's seeing it. Eastern Europe, the mass shootings are in broad daylight, many places, and they're forcing the public to come and witness the execution in the pits. It has to be in public.
Yeah, it's so
People have to see
interesting
it.
how it moves from, I guess, religious, how to basically constitute, maintain, and preserve these unitary, in this case Catholicism, and then it moves to the ethno-nationalist state, right? And how these are always being constituted against the Jewish people as the enemy. Man, isn't that, including today, right? If we talk about today's media politics, and sorry, I'm really very annoyed with the pro-Hamas folks and how things get shipped up in the media here. But yeah, at what point are we going to realize it's like, in order to constitute your little political fanatic or religious fanatic sphere, you're always going to evoke somehow the Jews as the enemy, as has been done, right? I mean, at what point are we going to see through that, And why is it still so
We were
effective
talking
today?
about, in our launch, we were talking about how everything started during the Inquisition. The Inquisition were the ones really inventing the framework for what happened after, during Nazi Germany, and then the totalitarian systems in both sides of the ideological spectrum, on the left and the right, and how that mentality is a continuum in history that is being permeating the political system everywhere. Okay, and rich country, poor countries, Europe, Africa, South America, Asia. It doesn't have boundaries because it's a human aspect that is there, and we have to deal with it, and we have to educate, and we have to do this kind of events precisely to educate. And then, in the case of the Sephardi, I think that the history of the Sephardim can make the case for how really these things can be dangerous for not only one group, but for the entire society, right? But I would like to change the topic because I read recently an article about colleagues from the University of Toronto, I think it is. And it's a very interesting School of Economics of the British Columbia in Vancouver. And they are talking about, they did a research, sociological research, you were talking about sociology, they did a sociological research in combination with economics, finding out how in Spain, the population, the mentality of this menticide concept that I'm thinking about that how this menticide concept really penetrates the life of the communities, and they were able to demonstrate how certain places in Spain, when the Inquisition was most strong, those places today conserve central ways of thinking and behaving that is affecting their own economical and cultural development in Spain. I can give you the biography after.
In a positive or
In a negative way, in a
Okay.
negative way. How even today, that mentality that was promoted, invented, implemented by the Inquisition is affecting people today. Is there not only in the spectrum of the politics, right? But in the spectrum of sociology.
But that makes total sense, because
the-
people who are sort of like always judgmental of others are going to be less open, right? Not participate in, you know, like a shared public spheres in which differences manifest, and hence, you know, being folded in, you know, isn't really conducive to trade or, you know, investments, or do you know what I mean? I mean, it makes complete sense.
No, I don't think what you think it is. I think that
Yeah.
I think that there are a nature of things, a nature of behavior
Right.
that are normal. Some people are more open, some people are more private. But when you have an institution that forces people to behave in certain ways, that is the problem, and that's what the Inquisition did, right? I mean, all of us could be more public or more private in our issues, anything, you know. But when you have an institution that is saying to people, you have to behave in this way, and implement that for the. I'm coming from Cuba, and I know what I'm talking about. When you have a government, an institution, or any structure system in the government telling you what you have to think, what you have to say, how you have to behave, who you have to ally with, that kind of thing, you know, the content of those policies or laws could be different, but the effects are the same.
You know, it's the same in East Germany. Exactly the same.
Yeah.
The after effects of lack of economic activity and that mindset of, you know, communism and but okay, another conversation.
No,
Apologies.
thank you so much. I mean, we're actually pretty much at the end of our time available, but this has been such an exciting and vibrant discussion. This has been really wonderful. I think we all want your reference, Jesus, by the way, because we want to read that piece because it sounds fascinating.
I'm gonna
Thank
send
you
it right
so
away to
much,
you.
Isaac, for such a stimulating, exciting talk.